Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Gilliland, and I'm one of the founding attorneys of the Legal Geeks. Thank you for joining us at WonderCon at home for the bright legal future of Star Trek. Our panelists today include Circuit Judge John Owens from the Ninth Circuit, Bethany Bengfort, Steve Chu, Nari Ely, and myself, who will be moderating. Our panel today will talk about some of the big issues that we've seen in Star Trek from all generations. We'll hit the rule of law. We'll address representation and the practice of law. We'll talk about refugees, rights of artificial life, that wonderful issue with Tuvix, and lots of trial advocacy. First up, season 3 of Discovery really did a nice job getting into the importance of the rule of law. People are harassed by a broker who really does lean into bullying and not following any sort of rules. Society devolved into a giant barter system because warp drive failed, and the Federation basically collapsed from it. What's fascinating about season 3 is we have people who are holding on to their faith in the Federation, the idea of the rule of law, that if something goes wrong, there will be others who will help, that there are laws that protect people's civil rights. And for today, we have seen that and experienced it across our society. And it is a wonderful snapshot of being able to understand bullies and the rule of the gun is not how anyone wants to live. Equality under the rule of law really is the goal of the Federation, and season 3 of Discovery does a nice job of hitting some of those big issues. Which brings us to the importance of the law and trials. And I want to bring up Circuit Judge Owens to talk about lower decks and how we see the rule of law and trials in this masterful animated series. Judge Owens?
Yeah, thanks so much. So for those of you who haven't seen Lower Decks, it's a fantastic show. And I will confess, I was a little bit skeptical of some of these new Star Trek shows. And I recommend everyone to check them out. But why am I showing a slide from the original series? Well, this is my favorite episode. This comes from The Balance of Terror. It's at the very end of the episode when Captain Kirk is consoling now the widow of the woman who was about to be married to Lieutenant Tomlinson, who passed away during the attack with the Romulans. He leaves the chapel and is walking down the hallway, and all of a sudden you see, I'm sorry to use this word, a menagerie of people walking by. And this is a screenshot from that episode. If you've seen that episode of Balance of Terror, you remember how many people walked by. And I've always wondered, who were those people? Like that guy in the blue jumpsuit. Where is he going? What is he doing? In the episode, a guy carrying a tube walks right by him. What was in that tube? Was it a poster? Was it like dilithium crystals? What are they doing? And the show Lower Decks does a fantastic job in a very funny way of explaining the lives of these people who you would see when the doors would open by sickbay and someone would walk by, or the conference room. It really delves into their lives. And the show itself does a fantastic job of highlighting some of the important messages of Star Trek while at the same time having a great sense of humor about it. I found myself laughing constantly during the show. I really recommend everyone to see it. It's on the CBS All Access platform. So a couple things about the show before we delve into the trial, some things I appreciated. When we think of Star Trek, we think of these majestic ships, the Enterprise, the Excelsior, the Reliant, the Excalibur. Apparently, when you get down to some of those kind of Class B ships, if I could call them those, they don't have such majestic names. They have names from random cities in California. The main ship is the Cerritos. Well, we also hear about the Rubidoux, the Merced, the Oakland, the Alhambra, the San Clemente, the Solvang, and the Sacramento. So clearly the writers love California, love WonderCon and Anaheim, because a lot of these cities are very close to there. And it was just kind of a nice wink to those of us who are big Star Trek fans. Other things I found interesting about Lower Decks, little throwback things. There's a Gorn wedding in this particular episode. The salt vampire from the Man Trap, the very first episode of Star Trek to ever air, makes an appearance. And apparently they still use lint rollers in the future. That's one of the things I learned from Lower Decks. All right, so now let's actually get down to this episode, and particularly Veritas. And what it tells us is that Star Trek, as the slide here says, Star Trek is all about trials. Every version of the show has had trials. Sometimes they're very traditional trials, like the episode Court Martial, the episode Menagerie with the fate of Captain Pike, and that's actually with a judge and defense lawyers and so forth. But then, of course, we know about all the other trials we have, like the Arena, with one of my favorite, not really a villain, but characters, the Gorn. There's the episode The Savage Curtain from the first Star Trek, where Abraham Lincoln is flying in space. Maybe not one of the best Star Trek episodes ever. But again, different types of trial. Trial versus good versus evil. Trial whether Captain Kirk should be court-martialed, and so forth. So imagine that menagerie, I'll use that word again, of trials. We're going to mix them up into the episode of Veritas. So, as you can see from this slide, and as one of the characters says in the episode, I think it's Rutherford, gosh, this is Alien Trial 101. As you can see from this slide, this courtroom looks very much like a Klingon courtroom we've seen in Judgment, a Klingon courtroom we've seen in Star Trek VI, the movie. There is the mysterious figures high up in the air. This particular trial, we actually get a verdict in well, yeah, we kind of do. We kind of don't get a verdict in this one. I don't want to give away the ending. But one thing I really appreciate about this one is that this is inquisitorial trial. There's no defense counsel. This is this guy in green you see here going at these 4 young members of the Lower Decks. Now, I don't want to spoil the ending of this one because it has a great little twist, but I do want to talk about some of the legal concepts that come up here. So first, as I mentioned, there was no defense attorney. Now, sometimes that's a bad thing in Star Trek. Sometimes you want a defense attorney. In Court Martial, Captain Kirk had a great defense attorney. Sometimes you don't want a defense attorney. If you're being tried in the Cardassian system of justice, a defense attorney is like a second prosecutor, maybe even worse than that. Now, you saw from the previous slide that the 4 crew members were all together testifying, one after the other. In our court system here, in the federal court system, there's something called the witness exclusion rule. Federal Rule of Evidence 615, which does not permit witnesses to listen to each other's testimony, absent some very unusual circumstances. Apparently, 615 did not make it to this galaxy because they repeatedly testify each other. And then the concept of contempt, punishment for not answering either the court's or an advocate's questions. Well, there is contempt here, but it's not to be thrown in jail or fined. It is to be put into a vat of eels, which is kind of an odd take. And then lastly, I think this is great. The horn he's holding right there, I believe it's called the Horn of Kandar. Candor, in other words. There are references to Drumhead, references to all kinds of the great Star Trek trial episodes. So great episode, great series. If you haven't checked it out, please do so.
Thank you, Your Honor. Bethany, let's talk about the importance of the right to life for artificial beings and whether or not the Federation could just simply ban all artificial life.
Absolutely. Now, this was one of my favorite parts of Picard, was actually thinking about the synth ban. So what had happened was a group of A500s, I guess, for appearances, it's a little complicated what actually happened, but they went rogue and they attacked a fleet that was being built to aid in the evacuation of Romulus. And when they went rogue and attacked, they killed over 92,000 people, so a lot of people. And so this caused a huge upheaval, a huge backlash, and the Federation ended up implementing what they called a synth ban. Now, this ban had 3 parts. The first was that it banned the creation of new synthetics. The second was that all existing synthetics were dismantled. And then the third is that it prohibited any sort of research or dissemination of information about building synthetic life. But the third part of that I really wanted to focus on was the ban on creating new synths. Again, if synths are viewed as more of a weapon, which I think would be a difficult argument to make, given that synths had been operating peacefully for many years. But if you view them as sentient life, could you ban their creation? And I think there are some interesting parallels to that in constitutional law in terms of the right to procreate. So in 1935 in Skinner versus Oklahoma, the United States Supreme Court ruled unconstitutional the Habitual Criminal Sterilization Act, which allowed the state to impose a sentence of compulsory sterilization as part of their judgment against individuals who have been convicted of 3 or more crimes of moral turpitude, which is a term of art that people love to use in the legal world. Basically, crimes that we consider to be really wrong or really immoral is a crime of moral turpitude. And so what they said is that the right to procreate is a basic civil right of man. It's not actually enumerated anywhere in the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't say the government shall not infringe the right to have children of any man. But the justice in this case determined, hey, this doesn't need to be explicitly enumerated. It's a basic civil right, and therefore it merits equal protection under the 14th Amendment.
Let's touch on one of the other issues in Picard dealing with synths. And, we have characters that either murder other people, like Maddox gets murdered, 7 of 9 goes on a killing spree, and those are mulligans. Like there's no legal repercussions for the fact they murdered people. We have Soji, who attempts genocide of all organic life in the universe, and she gets a mulligan. Could you share your thoughts on, is that okay? Like, do we want that? Because you can attempt a crime and still be charged for the attempt of carrying out that crime.
Well, that's a really good question. We really want to incentivize people to not commit crimes, so to stop committing crimes they may have intended to commit. But it's a good question here. Could Soji actually be prosecuted for attempt? So the 2 elements of attempted murder are you have to take at least one direct step towards the murder of another person. I think that here that is absolutely fulfilled. Soji attempts to send out a beacon that could potentially bring the Alliance of Synthetic Life to come destroy all organic life in the universe. And it's definitely ineffective because it doesn't end up happening. That's what ineffective means, that it's attempted murder and not murder, because nobody ends up dying. The harder question, I think, is whether she intended to kill all organic life. So what she definitely was attempting to do. So what happens is that the Romulans are coming to wipe out this colony of synthetic life forms on this planet because the Romulans believe that they are going to end up destroying all organic life, which is a terrible thing. And so Soji, who understandably does not want to be killed and does not want, all synthetic life to be killed, believes that the only thing she can do to stop it is to call on this alliance of synthetic life who will come. And it is not entirely clear whether they intend to or are going to wipe out or get all organic life. It's definitely a possibility, but there is a message from them that basically says humans will destroy themselves in their efforts to destroy us. We will come protect you. And it's definitely very hinted that they're going to destroy all non-synth life in the universe. And so she may not, she certainly intended to kill the Romulans who were coming to attack her. I think that could be analyzed under a different lens, like if she only intended to kill them, whether it's, again, we'll get into self-defense in a second, or, an act of war or something like that. But she definitely at least didn't care about the extremely high risk of the synths coming to destroy all human life, which under the law would be called extreme indifference to human life, which is, second-degree murder, or something that would permit you to find second-degree murder. And I think that is a very classic example here. So I think the 2 elements of attempt are met in some way.
Excellent. Well, let's get into some of the other legal issues from Star Trek that we know and love, and that's Tuvix. Nari, you get a transport accident that fuses two people into one. Is it okay to separate them and kill the new guy?
I just wanted to mention that this question actually came to me from a fan, and I couldn't believe what a good question it was. So to give a very quick recap of this episode, in the episode titled Tuvix of Voyager, I believe it's in season 2, there is a transporter accident while Tuvok, the chief of security, and Neelix, the beloved or hated, depending on how you look at him, ship's cook, is merged basically into a third person who shares characteristics of both, including down to his genes, called Tuvix. Because in our universe, as we know it, our reality, when a person is gone, they're gone. And in general, the law in the United States and pretty much everywhere recognizes sort of identity of people in physical beings. So while in the Star Trek universe, you could definitely have a person have their consciousness downloaded into a computer, or you have data or Soji, for example, who are artificial life forms that do not involve then physical beings, right, or physical bodies. So there's complicated notions in Star Trek about identity. At least in our notions of reality, we would not consider Tuvok and Neelix to still exist, right? So there's this interesting argument about whether or not they exist within Neelix or whether or not they still exist, but sort of combined within a Tuvix, sorry. But for our purposes, generally speaking, you're not going to be able to go to court to try to represent the interests of people who do not have bodies anymore. So that's a serious problem. The other one is a little funny from my perspective, at least, but it's still actually kind of interesting to think about, is of course that, if you wanted to have Kes or T'Pel sue to get their husbands back, the person who they're suing would be Tuvix, since he can undergo another transporter procedure in order to split into his sort of parent entities, I would say. And of course, in order to, in general, there are some interesting exceptions in the law that aren't relevant here, but in general, in order to actually bring someone into court and ask a judge to have them do something for you, be it give you money or perform an act for you, they have to have some kind of connection to an injury that you have, right? If you were, I think in this case, very clearly, Kes and T'Pel have injuries. They've lost their husbands. There's a potential, wrongful death or things like that. But in this case, Tuvix has no actual connection to that injury. He is the result of the transporter accident, but he did not cause it. And I think it would be interesting because there's a slightly different world here if somehow the entity known as Tuvix actually had some kind of hand in creating himself out of Tuvok and Neelix. But in short, no, you're not going to be able to go into a U.S. court and have a judge issue specific performance against a person who has no culpable connection to an injury that you have suffered. And specifically here, and this is kind of the rub of this entire episode, you're not going to have a judge anywhere in the United States order specific performance, which will result in that person's certain death. So in this case, he would, from Tuvix's perspective at least, a judge would be ordering his suicide in order to split. And again, that this topic of whether Tuvix dies as a result of splitting him back into Tuvok and Neelix is itself a long, interesting discussion. Without getting into it too much, I'm just going to take for granted for now that he is in fact a unique third individual who is a person recognizable under the law and who will cease to exist if he is split. So that brings us, of course, to, I think I can talk about things that happened in Voyager without worrying about spoiling them. So that brings us, of course, to the conclusion of the episode, in which Captain Janeway personally performs the transporter operation to split Tuvix back into Tuvok and Neelix. Of course, the doctor, the holographic doctor, refuses to participate because he does believe that Tuvix is a person and that splitting him will kill him. So under his Hippocratic oath, which of course is first do no harm, he refuses to participate. So this brings up the interesting question. And I think this is actually why Captain Janeway does this personally, is because she does wonder if, very seriously, if this is in fact killing Tuvix and doesn't want to order someone else to do that. So there's, the interesting question is, did she commit murder when she split Tuvix back into his constituent people? So there's, I think, if we accept that Tuvix is a person who dies as a result of this, that satisfies the first one. Of course, if I were Captain Janeway's defense lawyer, I would argue that he did not in fact die, that he split into two people. I might compare it to splitting Siamese twins. But so if we accept, though, that Tuvix was a unique individual who ceased to exist as a result of that, I think you would fit most of the elements, or sorry, all of the elements here for murder, including the part where she specifically intended the act to kill him, to end his existence. You can again get into whether or not she believed that she was killing him, but she certainly specifically intended the act that resulted in his death. You would then bring up potential defenses, again, if I were Captain Janeway's defense lawyer. And while most of the two defenses I've listed here, the first one, defense of others. Now, again, in our version of the law, in which we generally associate identity with a body, having a body there, I don't think you could raise the argument for defense of others, because she, may argue that she was acting in defense of Tuvok and Neelix in order to save their lives. However, in our universe, we do not recognize Tuvok and Neelix as still existing. They cannot, since they don't have bodies, they cannot exist. They are not there to be defended. In this case, it's more like committing a human sacrifice in a world with magic, which will then bring them back to life. But they do not currently exist. So I don't think she can raise defense of others. I also don't think she can argue that she was merely exercising her duty. And this then I think also brings us into the subject of, is it at all different that they would be operating under military law? So I could go on at some length on a couple different topics. I'll try to confine myself here. So, but one background principle that is worth mentioning, because it's the Uniform Code of Military Justice, UCMJ, is not often discussed outside of particular niche military or legal circles. There's a common notion that you lose a lot of rights when you join the military. And while that can be true, there's certainly a lot of rights that you don't check at the door when you put on a uniform. And one of them, of course, would be you still have basic civil liberties, including your right not to be killed. And so Article 118 of the UCMJ is a prohibition essentially on murder. It reads that any person subject to this chapter who, without justification or excuse, unlawfully kills a human being when he has a premeditated design to kill, intends to kill or inflict great bodily harm, is engaged in an act which is inherently dangerous to another, and evinces a wanton disregard of human life. So that's basically, again, the basic offense of murder with potential for defense and justification. The other thing that I want to mention about the UCMJ is whether or not it condones an act like Captain Janeway did. So, because she doesn't solely justify her actions on the basis that, Tuvix is not a person with cognizable interest different from Tuvok and Neelix, or that she is trying to save Tuvok and Neelix alone. She also brings up the fact that as ship's captain, and again, they're stranded all the way in the Delta Quadrant, all by themselves, and will not see another Federation ship for years, that it is strongly in the interest of her ship and her mission, which now is to get back to the Alpha Quadrant, to have her chief of security back, and to some extent to have Neelix back, since he was their cultural guide as well as morale officer. And while Tuvix has the memories of both of them, he has very different interests and is no longer strictly interested in performing the duties of her experienced security officer. And the short answer here is that no, the Uniform Code of Military Justice doesn't have anything in it to condone or otherwise excuse an order in which you can essentially paraphrase this as an order to die or an order to kill oneself. Now, there is a difference between, for example, ordering a soldier to undertake a mission that is extremely dangerous or even so dangerous that it is suicidal. But of course, the worst that could happen in that case is that you can still have a soldier disobey an order, at least under our military law. They could get in trouble if it was a lawful order, of course. But there is a difference between ordering a soldier to do something that was within your military authority, which is to do a very dangerous mission, and ordering them to do something that is not within your military authority, which is like to jump off a cliff. And in this case, unfortunately, I do come out on the side that, Janeway, while I love her very much as a character, and I understand why she did what she did, I do think that in this case, she did in fact commit murder of Tuvix, and may have to stand a court-martial for that when she gets home.
Let's move into the other issue of Romulan refugees that we see in Picard after the supernova. Steve?
Hi, everyone. So Star Trek is always very good at presenting cutting-edge issues, powerful current events. And in the Picard timeline, we are confronted with the question, what do we do when an age-old enemy needs our help? And we've seen this before in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, when the Klingons suffered a mining accident on Praxis. And that was in many ways modeled after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the former Soviet Union. So what do we do now when the Romulans have their own problems? What happens here is that the Romulan star is going to go nova. We have here an event that will kill billions within the Romulan star empire. And the Federation, in its finest traditions, has agreed to help their old adversary relocate their population to safe planets. First of all, we've got refugee issues, and there are some, there's international law that covers refugees. There are different sources of law, but if you analyze them, they have a couple common threads. And in general, we are talking about people who leave their country based on some form of well-founded fear due to some reason, such as political view or membership in a group such as race, religion, nationality, or social class. Those are typically, historically, the people that we have considered to be refugees. Then we also have a related category, the asylees. The main distinction here is that refugees request help when they are still in their home country. Asylees are typically people who sort of show up in the new country asking for help. We have some very close parallels between refugee law and what we call human rights law. However, there are some basic protections here for refugees, basic rights, freedom from torture, freedom of opinion and expression, things like that, liberty, life, security, right to asylum. So if we're looking at what legal bases would there be to protect the citizens of the Romulan Star Empire, here are some precedents for us. The practical reality now is we need to help, we the Federation, how do we help these, the Romulans? In the first episode of the Picard series, the retired Admiral Jean-Luc Picard compares the process to Dunkirk. It's a tremendous mission. The logistical issues are nearly a nightmare. We're going to need a lot of ships. Existing Starfleet ships would have to be diverted from current missions, or we build a new fleet of ships. And even if with a new fleet of ships, you got to get them all operational. How are you going to crew them? How are you going to staff them? We're talking about a single operation that would require much of the Federation's vast resources all to be allocated at one goal. So that would be a huge ask really for the Federation. We also have to find new locations for the resettlement, and that's not easy. What ultimately happens, just story-wise, narratively, we see a lot of this through the viewpoint of our old hero, now Admiral Jean-Luc Picard. He is in charge of the Romulan resettlement operation, and we have a number of issues. If we set aside just the legal implications and the legal bases for protecting Romulans and for why we should help them, we've also got political realities. The Romulan government has what can be charitably described as a complicated relationship with the Federation. Romulan society is based on secrecy and denial. What we see then in the novelizations is that the Romulan Empire actually denies that the Nova is going to even happen for a while. And then they start to slowly acknowledge it, but they downplay the dangers, and they don't engage in any huge resettlement effort. They just sort of do it slowly, because their primary goal is to maintain at least the illusion of control. They want to show that they're still powerful, they're in control, and they just don't want to ask for help as much as possible. The Federation now wants to help an old adversary and an adversary that doesn't necessarily want to be helped. So what does the Federation do? Do you force your help upon them? Or do you have to respect their sovereignty? We kind of go back to the Prime Directive in a way. And then within the Federation, we have our own internal politics. Some member worlds object to to the volume of resources that are being diverted to this settlement effort. We get, in essence, a Federation first type of movement. And we see one senator named Quest who represents a lot of the smaller Federation worlds. And they say, hey, what about us? Our interests are always trampled upon by the large worlds. We need to have some help. So yes, we care about the Romulans, but we should care maybe more about Federation member worlds. It is a monumental challenge, to say the least.
Thank you, Steve. Bethany and Nari, can you two both help us understand the representation that we've seen in Star Trek for attorneys?
Absolutely. Well, I think the first thing is that, as you can see from this video image, that Star Trek has never shied away from representing, different kinds of people, even alien life forms, women, people of different races, in any position, in positions of authority, judges, lawyers, and all of that. And well, I think it's important to point out that their representations have not always been perfect, particularly in terms of their representations of women. It was still incredibly groundbreaking. I mean, Court Martial, this episode aired in 1967, and back then the statistics for women and minorities in the law were just, terrible. Honestly, they're still kind of terrible. 86% of lawyers in the United States are non-Hispanic whites in this country now. One of the wonderful things about it is it doesn't even treat it like it's a big deal. It treats it like it's normal. It's unfortunately not normal, but it was very, very groundbreaking in the way that it represented people. And
if I could highlight that, Bethany, I think one of the things that has made Star Trek's diversity so special is that it envisions a future in which this kind of representation is not remarkable. In most instances, having the prosecutor in the trial of Kirk in the 1967 episode was that she was a female was not remarked upon. Having Uhura on the bridge, having Captain Janeway be a captain, it was a future in which it was not remarkable, which I think is, humbly speaking for myself, a wonderful aspiration.
Absolutely, and very great just growing up to be able to watch representations of women in these awesome roles on screen was great. In 1967, when they were showing women as prosecutors and as judges, only 3% of lawyers and people in the practice of law were women. Now in 2020, it's 37.4%, still far below the proportion of women that live in this country, but much better than it was back then. Interestingly, though, we just noted that this statistic has actually gone down since 2018. There was a slightly higher proportion of women in the legal field in 2018. And while we're not exactly sure what the cause of that, we might speculate it may have something to do with the pandemic and women being forced at higher rates to exit the workforce to take care of children when schools are closed. But either way, there has been a lot of progress, and Star Trek has been at the forefront of imagining a world in which more progress of that nature has been achieved.
Thank you both for helping us understand these issues. And Nari, let's talk about Tribbles and whether or not they're part of a balanced breakfast.
So I'm talking right now about the short trek, The Trouble with Edward. Short treks are some short films that were released by CBS along with the new Star Trek series, Star Trek Discovery. They're great, and this one in particular blew me away. It's incredibly funny. If you haven't seen it yet, you should go watch it. But in essence, it focuses around the then youngest captain, starship captain in Federation history, Captain Lucero, depicted in this picture in yellow, taking command of a small science vessel. And as one of her first acts, she decides to have her science officers get together to report on their ongoing projects to resolve a famine going on the planet below that they orbit. And Lieutenant Larkin, depicted here in the red shirt, I believe that's red, presents his project, which involves creating tribbles, which will breed more rapidly in order to be consumed as a meat source. This episode continues to get weirder and quirkier from there. That's all I can say about that. The first couple of questions that this raises involve, of course, the medical and scientific experimentation that Lieutenant Larkin is performing on Tribbles. The first thing that comes to mind is any of this controlled by the Animal Welfare Act? And if it does, is Lieutenant Larkin violating it? So the Animal Welfare Act lays out some basic standards with regard to care and avoidance of pain and things like that for some animals that are involved in experimentation. Not all. So this is the first hurdle here, is that the Animal Welfare Act covers things like cats and dogs and primates, and in fact, most mammals, warm-blooded mammals, but it specifically does not cover the animals that are most frequently used in lab experiments, including rats. And, you know, while I really, really love Tribbles, given their level of seeming complexity, it is difficult to say whether or not they would have been included in an Animal Welfare Act had the United States had Tribbles in its possession for experimentation at the time that act was passed. But assuming that it does apply, then there are certain basic standards of care. Researchers are supposed to avoid imposition of unnecessary pain. That I'm not entirely sure here that Lieutenant Larkin is following. You know, he doesn't give a whole lot of details, or the show doesn't give a whole lot of details about how these Tribbles are being handled, except for them sitting on top of tables and things. Except that we do know, of course, that Lieutenant Larkin has tried eating at least a couple of them, and which also raises an issue involving the Humane Slaughter Act. So it's, you know, he would have to be following certain guidelines with respect to that. I think given his level of competence, it is safe to assume that he is probably running afoul of some laws that govern the welfare of animals. So then last thing I'll mention just briefly on that topic is that there is, of course, an issue. There is actually an issue in this episode of human cloning, because minor comedic spoiler, Lieutenant Larkin gets Tribbles to reproduce at the rate that they do. Apparently before he interfered with them, they reproduced very slowly by infusing them with his own DNA. That is as horrible and gross and hilarious as it sounds. Which raises one interesting question, which is, you know, could this be human cloning? And if so, would that violate any laws here in the United States? And I think this is kind of interesting to mention, just because I think it surprises most people to learn that there are not actually any federal level laws, at least, that prohibit human cloning. There are, however, plenty of ways that the federal law indirectly prohibits it through restrictions on funds and other things like that, so that we effectively have a ban on it in the United States, even though it's not expressly so. And some states do outright ban it.
Thank you, Nari. Let's take a look at discrimination against XBs, because for some reason, people are not cool with former members of the Borg re-entering society. Steve, can you help us understand these issues?
So as any Star Trek fan knows, the Borg are one of, in my opinion, the greatest villains ever created in the science fiction genre. What do we know about Borg drones? XBs essentially are ex-Borg drones. So let's start off again. Borg drones are made up of species that are typically assimilated against their own will, and then they are forced to join a group consciousness. And as drones, they commit acts of violence and destruction, war crimes. They assimilate entire worlds, people, for their technology. They conquer. Now, the flip side of this, and part of what makes them so fascinating, is because they can be deprogrammed. And we have seen several examples of this during the Star Trek series. We have Hugh, one of the early Borg drones who was freed from assimilation. And we see him in the Picard series. Many years later, he's even more free of the Borg implants now than ever before and looking far more human. So we learn when Picard goes to the artifact that it is possible to undo some assimilation on a level never before seen. So as a result, the number of XBs has grown over time. Now, what do we do legally with these XBs as they continue to grow? How do we treat them? We can look at, in terms of legal precedents, there are many laws, rules that prohibit discrimination and that protect members of various groups. Here's a sampling, but we protect race, religion, natural origin, age, sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity, pregnancy, familial status, and veteran status. So can we protect XBs? I mean, let's talk about that and explore that a little bit. Again, kind of remaining at a high level, because as fascinating a topic as this is, it would require a pretty lengthy discussion to really hit all the bases. But one possibility that has been raised is that we could find protection for XBs under the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is a possible source of legal protection because the law itself protects entities and prohibits discrimination on the basis of some form of disability. And this would depend on how we classify XBs, former Borgs. And that really is the million-dollar question. How do we classify them? Is being assimilated and then becoming unassimilated, de-assimilated, is that a disability? Well, a disability under the existing laws defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. XBs have typically suffered tremendous physical trauma, emotional scarring, and it limits their major life activities, even for those that escape the collective and try to have their own individual lives. We see that they all have sort of varying degrees of success. Some are able to go on and live fuller lives, like 7 of 9 and Picard. Others actually will die shortly afterwards, as we see from the trio that appeared in Star Trek Voyager. We do need to focus really on the question of how do we classify them. Hugh refers to the XBs as the most hated species in the quadrant. Well, let's look at a couple possibilities for how we classify former Borg drones or XBs. If they're property, and this would be really the harshest definition for classification for XBs, then they really have very little rights, very few rights, if any at all. And the XBs would not have much recourse for legal protection. And they would be really subject to the whims of their owners, the collective, or anyone that could lay claim to them. And certainly some people do treat Borg drones as property. As we see in the Picard series, there's a large black market for Borg parts, and Borg drones are hunted so that people can harvest their implants, because the implants themselves are valuable and can be used for many purposes. So this would be, if you are an XB, or if you care about the XBs, the property classification is the one you want to fight for sure. Next, we have war criminals. Could they be considered war criminals similar to soldiers or generals who in wartime commit terrible acts? And we've had war crimes trials in the past. There is international law precedent for how we deal with people like this. It's a real struggle for society in general, how to deal with people who commit what often would be considered unspeakable acts. However, it's committed during wartime, a time during which we tolerate things that we would not otherwise tolerate during peacetime. If XBs are war criminals, the good news is they would at least have some more rights, some rights to counsel, but they would have to stand trial, and no one knows how that would play out. Similarly, a related category would be if we classify them as soldiers following orders, and if the XB said, look, I knew this was wrong, but I did it because I had to follow orders, the orders of the collective in this case. How would that play out for the XBs? There are some possibilities here for the XBs, but this would be difficult as well, because in general, the laws recognize that a soldier should not obey a immoral or illegal order. And certainly terrorizing, destroying entire planets, destroying entire civilizations and individuals would likely qualify as an unlawful order. Finally, and this would be the most favorable classification for XBs, would be victims. And this is how Picard comes to see the XBs when he visits the artifact, that the Borg drones, former Borg drones, are in fact victims because they were taken against their will, doing things that they did not want to do, and they were trying to escape. It's sort of like being alive but not being alive yet not being in control of what happens. And then the companion point, after we talk about how to classify them and how to deal with them legally, where do we put them? And this is similar to the question we tackled earlier about the Romulan refugee crisis. Where do XBs belong? Do they get repatriated to their former homeworld? Would the former homeworld from which the species came actually accept a former Borg drone who used to be a member of that species? I mean, we don't know. Should we create a new XB homeworld, perhaps? Maybe, but we would have to find a place. We could do something like the Romulans do with the Reclamation Project, although, that was certainly, the Romulans are not really known for their altruism. That was really a research project for them to develop additional technology and, for other purposes. What do we do? And can we de-assimilate other Borg drones too? There's no easy answer. And I think that's, again, what Star Trek does so well, is that there's not so much a black and white, but there's a lot of gray.
Thank you, Steve. That was, it's a fantastic issue to explore in Picard. Circuit Judge Owens, can you illuminate us on the issues of attorney competency for Klingons and a system that seems much more rough and tumble than our own?
Well, certainly it is, Josh. There are some similarities. There are some big differences. On the Klingon bar exam, the answer to every question is simply honor. Sometimes honorable, but usually honor will do. And it seems to be that's the correct answer to pass the bar for those who have taken it. But there are some similarities and some significant differences between the systems. First off, the very beginning of this episode, in which Captain Archer's on trial for allegedly assisting some people who are rebelling from the Klingon Empire, he's told, you've got to prove your innocence. So right off the bat, we know we're in a little bit of a different arena. But in this arena, we do have prosecutors and defense counsel. And so let's take a minute and talk about the roles that they play in this episode and what we can learn in terms of our legal system. So first, I believe we have a slide on the prosecutor. Good old Arak. He is kind of your classic Klingon guy. He's played very well in this episode. And he does have an obligation to pursue the truth, and he has an obligation to bring charges if probable cause exists. I think one question in this case is, was there probable cause to bring this case? Because this case, the allegation that Captain Archer, in effect, aided and abetted rebels against the Klingon Empire by taking them on board his ship and then actually attacking a Klingon warship, the entire case is based on the word of one person. That is Captain Duras, the Klingon captain. So when your case is based on one witness, you need to know whether that witness is telling the truth or not. And the ABA rules, you'll see it up there on the screen, that you could not bring a case if you know that the case lacks probable cause. So what does Arak have to do? He has to take steps to make sure that the witness's story, the Captain Duras is telling, is in fact accurate. If he has reasons to believe it's not accurate, there's actually a Supreme Court case, Napoli versus Illinois, that talks about how prosecutors may not knowingly put on false testimony. Did Arak do that here? You can make the argument he did, or look, we'll take it at face value. We can accept the fact that he believed the story of the captain. If that's the case, then he did not violate the guidelines. If he did know there was falsity here, then he would have violated the guidelines. I also say this about Arak. He has a bad demeanor in the courtroom. He's always interrupting witnesses. This does seem to be the Klingon way, but I certainly would not tolerate that in the courtroom. I think the more interesting character in this episode is the defense attorney, Kolos. It's clear he is an old guard attorney. He has kind of resigned himself to the fact that the Klingon justice system is not what it once was. He talks about the loss of honor, for example. And at the beginning of the trial, he mails it in. Literally, he doesn't even cross-examine the one Klingon witness against Archer. So at the beginning of the trial, he was not doing a good job. He was not effective. But then over time, he kind of gets his mojo back. And he realizes, hey, wait a second. I used to be a good lawyer. In fact, he talks about how at one time he had won 200 cases. And he's saying, now, you know what? I'm going to turn it on. I'm going to get that mojo back. I'm going to be the lawyer I once was. And then does a fantastic job on behalf of Captain Archer. Now, this episode actually reaches a verdict. I mentioned sometimes it happens in Star Trek, sometimes it doesn't. This one it does. And Archer is found guilty and sent to that horrible salt mine planet the Klingons sent everyone to, basically to die. You might say, well, how was he effective then? His client was convicted. Well, first, you can't weigh a lawyer's ability or performance on the result. Sometimes it's an unwinnable case. But second, the most important thing he did was he made sure that Captain Archer avoided the death penalty. And in many times in cases, you have to define victory a certain way. Defense attorneys may have a client who's clearly guilty of first-degree murder, but if they can convince the jury not to do the special circumstance which would lead to a death penalty, that actually is victory. So in this case, I think Kolos was very effective by saving the life of Captain Archer. He did, though, forget the most important thing when you're a defense attorney is the following, that whatever you do, if someone's going to jail, make sure it's not you, make sure it's your client. And unfortunately, through his advocacy, through his mojo, as I called it, he ends up getting the same sentence as Captain Archer. Captain Archer is released, he escapes. Poor Kolos is left in that salt mine. Anyway, great episode, great explanation of how important defense attorneys can be, because you saw what happens when he mails it in, and you also saw when he really is advocating for his client.
And I love his closing, because it is, granted, it's the blaze of glory, but it's what lawyers dream of being able to do, of swing for the fences with for somebody's rights so they're not trampled upon.
Yes.
Which brings us to the second trial episode that is probably one of the best. I think Rules of Engagement and Judgment are tied at number one for being the most accurate trials that we see in Star Trek. And Bethany, can you help us understand the legal issues with Worf's trial that happens on Deep Space Nine?
Absolutely. Now, Rules of Engagement is one of my favorite trial episodes in Star Trek. It's a very interesting premise. It's actually the Klingon Empire is requesting the extradition of Worf, and this extradition request is based on Worf having destroyed a Klingon civilian transport. And the whole theme of this trial is whether Worf destroying the civilian transport was truly an accident, or whether he intended to murder these Klingon civilians. Now, it turns out the entire incident was staged. There were no civilians aboard the transport. It was all invented in order to try to create fodder for this extradition request. But it was a very interesting trial in general, just because of the types of evidence that they introduced and the various things that happened throughout this episode. So one of the more interesting types of evidence that was introduced was they had one of the witnesses offer evidence on Worf's conduct during one of the holodeck games. Essentially, in this game, Worf would pretend to be this very famous Klingon warrior, and at the end of the holodeck experience, that warrior would order the complete destruction of this civilian town, and that was how the episode ended. And so the prosecutor in this case tried to use that as evidence of Worf's violent nature, of his desire to kill Klingon civilians and all that. This is very interesting. This kind of reminded me of the general argument that, violent video games cause violent behavior in people, an argument that really hasn't proven to be true based on studies. But in general, this type of evidence is not admissible in court, and we would classify that as character evidence of someone's character. It can be admissible if, for example, Worf's counsel, Cisco, had tried to introduce evidence of Worf's peaceful nature. Then the prosecutor could have come back and said, no, he's not peaceful. They're allowed to rebut the evidence, character evidence, if the defense counsel opens the door to that evidence. One tricky way in which character evidence sometimes comes in is if intent is an aspect of the crime, so a person's intent in doing something, and I think that they are arguing that what's in Worf's heart, and actually Klingons have two hearts, but whichever heart is responsible for intent, what is there whether it matters. And so I think what the prosecutor was trying to say, and he mentions that this holodeck experience, Worf played it the day before he blew up the civilian transport. So I think that he would try to argue that the evidence is demonstrating that Worf wants to kill civilians, that this is part of something he enjoys doing. And given the proximity and time to the actual incident, then maybe a judge would let it in. I think a defense attorney would argue, no, they're just trying to show that Worf is a violent person in general, and that's inadmissible character evidence. But either way, a very interesting aspect of this trial.
Thank you, Bethany. Well, let's talk about the different trials that we've seen in Discovery Season 3, because it's a very different world when it comes to having a logical debate. Steve?
Discovery Season 3 takes a show in a new direction. We go into the far future, which is some real bold storytelling. Well, here are a couple of orienting rules for us. First of all, we learned that the planet Vulcan has been renamed to Ni'Var. And in terms of resolving disputes, we have an interesting story element where the Federation is trying to obtain what's called the SB-19 data. Ni'Var refuses, and so Michael Burnham, who provides an in here as the sister of Spock, she is a graduate of the Vulcan Science Academy and invokes what's called the Tikal Inket. We see that the Tikal Inket is actually a scientific inquiry process, not necessarily intended as a judicial trial, but it is a process that has the goal of truth-seeking. It's a philosophical process designed to unearth deep truth, and there are a couple requirements. It can only be invoked by graduates of the Vulcan Science Academy or what is now the Ni'Var Science Institute. The invoker presents their argument. They can be questioned. The advocate can also question or speak, and in this situation, the advocate, in fact, questions the client, Michael Burnham. And we don't have particular witnesses. There's no judge to rule on objections. There's no rules of evidence, because people discuss things that are not in front of the forum. They say, well, here's what the SB-19 data says. Well, okay, I mean, that right there could be hearsay. There could be foundational problems. But here, people just talk about it freely. And also, we have audience members that just get up and speak at some point. So what's really interesting is this is still a method of dealing with disputes that is rooted in ancient tradition. Vulcan itself and Ni'Var now is a fascinating blend of new science, but also old sort of ancient ways. And in the big picture, the invoker, as we learn, can achieve their goal without convincing the quorum, so long as they convince somebody else in the room. Josh?
Thank you, Steve. Everyone, thank you for watching our panel today. You can follow the Legal Geeks at thelegalgeeks.com and all social media at the Legal Geeks. For all of our panelists today, thank you for your time, talent, and expertise. And everyone, live long and prosper.